Speed.
As you noticed, the music just went off, and so I think we're about ready to start. If you haven't had a seat yet, please do so as quickly as you can. I'm Dar Roberts, and I'm chairing the committee that organized this. I would like to welcome all members of the audience and distinguished guests to the inaugural presentation in the Wildfire Prevention and Policy Lecture Series. This series was enabled by generous donor support. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge members of the organizing committee, which I chair, including Professors Leila Carvalho, Frank Davis, and Sarah Anderson, Max Moritz from the Bren School, and Nick Elmquist from the Montecito Fire Department. I would also like to thank Dean Pierre Wiltsius for helping make this event possible. Although we are outside, the audience is reminded that they are welcome to wear their masks. Should you need one, restrooms are available in the building just west of Hatland Theater, so that's up there, right? After the talk, there will be a panel discussion and a question and answer session with microphones available to the public, and you can see those right there. And following a brief question and answer, there will be a reception at the SRB terrace starting at 5 p.m., and there should be good signage, and that's that direction. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Stephen Pyne. Dr. Pyne is an emeritus professor from Arizona State University. He earned his PhD from the University of Texas, Austin in 1976 in American Civilization. He was an associate and then associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Iowa before joining the Department of History in Arizona State in 1986. At ASU, he has been a member of a diversity of programs, including most recently the Human Dementias Faculty Group in the School of Life Sciences. He has written over 30 books and is probably best recognized for his seminal contributions to our understanding of the incidents, historical use, and management of wildfire. He is also a recognized expert in the history of science, science communication, and conservation. Over his career, he has won numerous awards. Recent books include The Pyrocene, How We Created an Age of Fire, and Between Two Fires, A Fire History of Contemporary America. With that, I would like to welcome Professor Stephen Pyne to the stage.
Well, good afternoon. Let me begin by thanking my host for the invitation to come and for providing such an unusual venue. I wish this could happen more often. This being Santa Barbara, I assume I don't have to explain why fire matters. Most of you are probably well versed in the arc of American, certainly California fire history, and can round up the usual suspects for causes. But let me try this afternoon to give a different frame to some of what most of us understand.
Okay.
And base it around,
On him, correct?
if we can get this to work.
Okay,
Did it go off?
gotcha. All right, I'm gonna move
Doesn't
to
seem
the
to
side
be
to
working.
get more of a 3-4.
All right, well, technology, there we are. Always have backups. I once was invited at the University of Wyoming and gave a lecture in a large auditorium, and right in the middle, the entire power for the system went off, and nobody said a word. And so I gave the rest of the lecture in my mind, imagining the slides rolling by, and everybody was fine at the end of it. The power went back on. We had a reception, and all went well. So, are we doing better? Okay, organize it around something I've taken to calling the Pyrocene, and look at the modern history of the American fire scene within 3 fires. I like to begin the story here. This is the first map of forest fires that I know of in the U.S. It was produced for the 1880 census, incredible as that may be. It doesn't include grasslands, sage steppes, deserts, other places, and some places where there aren't enough people to collect the information. But it's a very interesting pyrogeography and quite different from what we see today. in many ways, America was the Brazil of its day, an agricultural society rapidly industrializing and opening up new lands, and criticized for the same kinds of reasons. Well, what made up that fire scene? Part of it was natural. Nature sets lots of fires. This is a map of ignitions, forest fires again, not all lightning-caused fires. I'm happy to say where I live in Arizona is pretty much the epicenter for this. These are starts, not burned area. And a very different map from what we see in 1880. Let's pause for a minute to look further at California. I recently had a chance to be in Yosemite and look at the park's fire experience, their attempts to restore fire, and it was striking how much of all the valued scenes had fire in it. Before at contact time, the valley was burned annually. The groves, the Mariposa Grove and other sequoia groves were burned annually. And much of the backcountry, we're told, were burned more or less annually. That's hard to believe in detail, but certainly in spirit it was. So plenty of fire. But we also have the main source of this pyrogeography are people. Indigenous people setting fire particularly in grassy areas or savannas, and Europeans adding to that, clearing for agriculture, introducing other kinds of livestock, and lots of other reasons. All this goes back actually to our own species history. We are the uniquely fire creature on what is a uniquely fire planet. Fire is part of our heritage. We are now the only creature that manipulates fire. It is, in a sense, a species monopoly. We got small guts and big heads because we learned to cook food. And then we went to the top of the food chain because we learned to cook landscapes. And now we've become a geologic force because we've begun to cook the planet. Well, that's the second fire. And with it, people made what in ancient times they would speak of as a second nature, taking the raw stuff that the natural world presented, remaking it with various kinds of artifice into a redesigned world, a second nature. And we have lots of evidence of accounts and others of what those fire practices were like. This is Galen Clark, the guardian of Yosemite, talking about the indigenous peoples burning essentially annually in Yosemite Valley. And here a little further north, the Plumas National Forest. This is 1904. And the survey, the Forest Reserve Survey, is talking about the white man picking up the torch dropped by the Indians who were accustomed to burning the forest. And everybody has come to think that this is perfectly natural. And everybody burns. The sheepmen and cattlemen on the open range, miners, lumbermen, ranchmen, sportsmen, campers. Everybody does this routinely and only becomes alarmed when an actual village or structure is under threat. So it's not just that indigenous knowledge was widespread. There was a lot of traditional knowledge, which has also been lost. Well, the third fire is this beast. It's industrial combustion. It's burning fossil fuels. And there's a great Currier and Ives across the continent, steam driving the progress of settlement. And particularly interesting in this is that one side is burning and the other side is not. And I'll come back to that. Because these are the three fires that have shaped the scene. All of those early fires, though, were in living landscapes, and they come with ecological checks and balances. People can change it, modify it. It's elastic, it's flexible, but there are still limits. When, however, we go to fossil fuels, or what I think of as lithic landscapes, those conditions change. And part of it is that the human quest for fire had always been about sources, finding more stuff to burn and ways to burn it. And now it's about sinks. We've got plenty of stuff to burn. We don't know what to do with all the effluent, which is overloading and disrupting more and more of the planet. And this kind of combustion doesn't have ecological baffles and barriers. You can burn day and night, winter and summer, wet or dry. So all of the old sort of interactive features with fire are gone now. And that is part of the power of this kind of fire, but also part of the danger. And it has led many people to conclude that our future is not only dire, but strange. So much so that we have no narrative by which to connect it, and we have no analog by which to guide us in the future. Well, that creates, in a sense, a third nature. We can watch how this conversion in fire changes all the habitats of significance to people. Domestic settings used to be filled with flames. Now we have alternatives. The fire, if there is one, is well off site and sublimated into electricity. What about urban settings? Our cities used to burn as often as the surrounding countryside. They were made of the same materials. That quit. What happened? Well, lots of things, but part of it is that, in a sense, they've passed through this industrial process, and now, in principle, they don't burn, which leaves us with the question of why are we having all these towns now burning? And what about agriculture? Outside of floodplains, almost all forms of agriculture and pastoralism required burning. Fallowing was required because you had to have stuff to burn to get the ecological jolt that was necessary to set up the crops. Now, fossil biomass has provided substitutes, chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, all of it delivered by machines. I mean, the whole green revolution, apart from the genetic selection for species, is all based on industrial combustion or those lithic landscapes. Well, then finally, what about wildlands? Wildlands become extremely vulnerable to markets and to entry once you have a new source of power to get into that. So here we have post-Civil War America, our version of the Amazon highway, cleared, burned, and more or less put into pandemonium. For 50 years, we have a wave of megafires, larger, in some cases an order of magnitude larger and more lethal than what we've seen in recent decades. This is mostly at the end of the Little Ice Age, in the 19th century. What's driving it? What's driving it is all of the debris left from logging and land clearing. And that gave rise to a sense that the state would have to intervene. And this became a global project under the doctrine of conservation. Something would have to stand between these forces. And what got that call, in a sense, was forestry. And in many ways, a terrible discipline to inherit this project because it grew out of Central Europe, a temperate climate that has no natural basis for fire, and saw fire only as a problem of social disorder, and saw it as an emblem of the primitive. So here's our first professional forester, born, raised, and trained in Prussia, Bernard Furneaux, dismissing the whole American fire scene as one of bad habits and loose morals. And here's Gifford Pinchot, our first native-born forester, in 1898, likening the question of fire control to that of slavery. A long fight that needs to be done as soon as possible. Foresters inherited the primary responsibility for conservation. These are some of the critical dates in bringing it to the U.S. 1891, Forest Reserves created. 1897, an Organic Act given to them. In 1905, the U.S. Forest Service given control. And at that point, we can begin a kind of modern institutional framework for fire. It was very much a progressive era undertaking. You wonder what they were thinking of. On average, there was one fire guard for every 670 square miles needing protection. They saw it primarily as a problem of preventing people from doing bad things. No sense that fire might have a natural order, no science by which to understand it at those times. It was a global project pursued in the northern Rockies as well as the central provinces of India. In fact, British India was in many ways the model globally, and one the U.S. Looked to. And if any of you are fans of Kipling, since we're talking about India, you might have wondered what happens to Mowgli after he grows up. Well, Kipling wrote a short story that tells that. Mowgli joins the Indian Forest Department and becomes a fire guard. And I love that because it shows the range of interest in fire and the way in which fire was associated with this general havoc that was going on. And fire was taken as the visible index of whether you were succeeding in your project or not. The origin story for the U.S., the 1910 fires are as good a point as any. The fabled big blow-up, 3.25 million acres in the northern Rockies, in most of it in late August 1910. And they actually mapped the smoke, by the way. These giant smoke palls were significant back then as well. And they identified the different characteristics of the smoke as you went further downstream from it. And of course, the story, 78 firefighters killed, 6 different incidents, all essentially at the same time. And Ed Pulaski holding his crew in at gunpoint at the Nicholson Adit, shown here in this photo. That same month, in California, Northern California, a controversy boiled over that became known as the light burning controversy. And this argued that the whole approach the Forest Service was taking, and indeed the whole vision that modern forestry proclaimed and that Europe seemed to establish as a model, was misguided. That what we really should be doing is emulating the American Indian and routinely, that is lightly, burning the landscape. If we did this, we would not have these big fires. If we don't do it, we will have large fires, we will have diseased forests, we will have insect-ridden forests, and what we really should do is call out the Army to start regular burning. This was a real congery, a real gaggle of people who didn't have an institutional or academic basis and hence could be dismissed. Included writers, poets. The Secretary of the Interior, however, went on record as supporting it. So that provides yet another challenge to the Forest Service. All this is happening while the Forest Service is being overwhelmed by this tragedy in the Northern Rockies. Oops. Here's Aldo Leopold in 1920 setting up for the Forest Service a fire protection system in the Southwest and arguing that light burning is a threat and needs to be countered, not only specifically for fire, but because of the larger implications. If this is true, how many other things have to be reevaluated? So one of our prophets of modern environmentalism at that time also saw it differently than we would today. The counter-argument was something the Forest Service called systematic fire protection, again developed in California. And it's also revealing here that not only are they countering the argument, but the technology. Instead of lighting using fire sticks and burning bark to light routine fires, we have machines. We have a counterforce in effect that can take on fire, and we can create a system in which our fires are bigger than nature's. The next four, this was the first crisis Henry Graves faced as new chief forester. The next 3 chief foresters, all through 1939, were personally on the fire line in 1910 and were determined it would never happen again on their watch. This was a kind of Valley Forge or Long March moment for an entire generation. And not until they were gone would another view be considered. Congress then passes, in the wake of the fires, the Weeks Act 1911, which sets up a mechanism for federal-state cooperation, most of it based on fire control. So we now have a matrix, a national matrix, for dealing with fire with the Forest Service at the center. So for the next 50 years, the Forest Service pursues this project pretty much as a hegemon. To some benign, to others not so much, with a singular policy, a singular mission. they go at it through all kinds of stuff. Unbelievable. How much of it also, by the way, is machine. The modern bulldozers apparently invented in California to build fire roads and fire breaks. The idea of putting a movable blade on the front. Airplanes are used shortly after World War I for aerial reconnaissance. Cars are put on rail lines. The whole thing, it's really quite extraordinary. But what about carrying this kind of protection into the backcountry? I mean, a lot of it doesn't have roads, poor trails, poor access. You can't find things, very poor communication. And what about that other backcountry in time? That is all this cut over and abandoned land. People have left rather than pay taxes on it. What do you do with fires on this scene? How do we rehabilitate that? Well, the solution will appear in 1933 with the New Deal, emergency conservation work on a huge scale, and the Civilian Conservation Corps. Probably half, it's estimated about half of what the CCC did related to fire protection, either pre-suppression or actual firefighting. For the first time, there was a civilian corps capable of fighting fires, building the roads to carry, putting in the lookouts, putting in the trails and telephone wires, and then actually fighting fires. Some of their projects are immense. This is another one. California was especially aggressive in using the CCC. This is part of an 800-mile-long fuel break from Bakersfield to Redding that spanned the entire western front of the Sierra Nevada. It was called the Ponderosa Way, and it was integrated with truck trails and other access points. Unthinkable unless you have thousands, indeed tens of thousands of young men to do the labor. Out of the CCC experience, we got some specialty crews, our smoke jumpers, 1939, and the 40-man crew, the progenitor of our modern hotshots. They not only had their own bus, they had their own cooks to go out this. They didn't have MREs and these other marvels that we have today. But in a sense, the means were so great that they changed the ends to which they might be put. And in the midst of this, after a bad fire in 1934, Chief Forester Gus Silcox announces a universal standard for control across the country. Every fire should be controlled by 10 o'clock the morning following its report. There it is. You know, he may have gotten his MBA someplace. Nice quantitative standard, clear objective, no equivocating. This is what it is. And he thought, we have the means now. As an experiment on a continental scale, we might be able to do that now. So that was in 1935. Lots of political interest. President Roosevelt fancied himself a kind of gentleman forester, was keenly interested in these programs. Here he is overseeing a new fire prevention campaign featuring Uncle Sam. And if you look closely, you'll notice that Uncle Sam looks suspiciously like the guy standing right next to him. It was, in fact, the artist, James Montgomery Flagg, who modestly modeled Uncle Sam on himself. And then it gets serious because it goes to war. World War II is a fire war in ways that wars had not been for a long time. Fire protection gets militarized, which it does every so often. The U.S. was subjected to assaults by fire balloons launched from Japan. They took 3 to 5 days to arrive. And of course, the war ends with a horrific new fire weapon, the atomic bomb. A famous photo from the Army archives, Hiroshima atomic strike. That cloud is not the mushroom cloud of the atomic bomb. That is the pyrocumulus cloud of the burning city. So the military has an interest in fire as a weapon and the need to defend fire, and will support, as part of a national security state, if you will, in the post-war era, a special interest in fire. Our first national fire prevention campaign started in Southern California, 1942, after a Japanese submarine shot at some oil depots near Goleta. And this got this kind of campaign going. It was a little too hardcore even for that time. Fortunately, Disney Studios had released Bambi. So Bambi is enlisted as our first cartoon fire emblem, fire protection, but Disney would only allow it 1 year, even in the midst of a world war. So the Forest Service invented a cartoon replacement, and yes, Smokey Bear was invented by a committee. And then eventually life imitates art, and we get Little Smokey, and off we go. Part of this militarization continues because there is a huge amount of war surplus equipment after World War II and then Korea. The Forest Service has priority access to this. And through this Forest Service, all the states, there is a transfer of equipment. So we can see here on the left, Southern California, we've got our armored divisions and air support. And on the right, back in Northern California, Mount Shasta in the background, a staged photo, but you can see how almost overnight it was mechanized. The CCC is gone, but we found a mechanical muscle to replace it. And yes, this is the other red menace. We are in a kind of Cold War on fire. So we mobilize science. Again, on the war example, we develop equipment development centers to help assist this transfer and adaptation of equipment. We develop fire-specific labs, which had never existed before, some of which has civil defense and military funding behind it. They are now interested in what a thermonuclear exchange might mean in terms of fires, what will burn, and so forth. Okay, and even Hollywood gets into the picture from about 1942 to the late 60s as sort of a golden era of fire movies. My favorite, Red Skies of Montana, released in 1952. It's clearly a war story with fire providing the battlefield. By 1960, it would seem the Forest Service had more or less built out its charge. It had done it. It controlled everything. All fire research, all equipment, all crews. It was the matrix for the states and other agencies. It spoke with the authority of academic forestry. And fire was now only about 13% or so of its budget. It seems that 50 years after the big blow up, you'd sort of gotten it. In fact, there was a famous study in public administration of the Forest Service which identified that agency as the paragon. This is as good as a public agency gets. And then the wheels fall off. So we spent 50 years trying to take fire out of the landscape. Now we're going to spend the next 50 years trying to put at least a fraction of it back in. So there's going to be an era of institutional change and policy change, trying to find ways to get good fire in, and to create an institutional framework that will not rely so much on one agency and its culture and historic interests. And in fact, civil society will emerge in a rather large way to influence this. And the public domain, all these national forests and large parts of the public domain had been a kind of multiple use melting pot. And the Forest Service, or its cognate in Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, was given a responsibility for making the decisions. Now we're going to see specific legislation to identify particular purposes, recharter all these agencies. The Wilderness Act will be a first example, and then others, all of which will challenge a Forest Service which had believed it was in the position to make these kinds of decisions. So we have what I think of as a fire revolution, beginning in 1962, two parts. One in Florida, it's basically on working landscapes. It's interested in prescribed burning. It's interested in traditional burning. It's interested in public and private. And the other part is in, California. Very different orientation. Interested in wild landscapes. Interested in public lands. Interested in wilderness. interested in natural fire, not just putting people back in with drip torches, because that's still people manipulating things. We want a more natural regime to reestablish itself. In '62, the Tall Timbers Research Station, a private outfit outside Tallahassee, Florida, begins a series of fire ecology conferences, provides a forum outside forestry and the agencies, immensely influential. '62, the Nature Conservancy conducts its first prescribed fire outside in a prairie outside Minneapolis. By 1968, the Park Service had reformed its fire policy, renouncing the 10 a.m. policy and establishing ways to reintroduce fire. 1978, the Forest Service did, on a much larger institutional scale, So the ideas are not new. The sense of urgency is not new. We're talking 40 to 50 years ago. Half of the modern life of American management of wildlands and fires. So what was the policy? Loosely, it could be called fire by prescription, classic prescribed fire on a Florida model. But for California and other places, there could be a prescribed natural fire, where you could write prescriptions, designate places, and let naturally ignited fires live out their natural life within conditions. And even on wildfires, an array of options. You can control it in the classic sense. You can confine it in a large area. You can contain the perimeter. All these are options. You're not required to do one thing. Essentially, all of the things that we rely on today were in place then. So why don't we see more results? What happened was that change in politics, a move away, active resistance against environmental reforms, a polarization of weather, of politics, a transfer from civilian to military funding, privatization, downsizing of federal investments. All of this isn't directed especially at fire, but fire will integrate it and suffer from it. Although by the mid-'80s, it looked like fire research was in hospice. One of the 3 labs was closed, and they were talking about the Riverside lab closing and making a last stand, a kind of fire research Alamo at Missoula, which fortunately didn't happen. But the pushback wasn't enough to remove all the reforms. It was enough, I think, to stall it. And so we have a lost decade. Probably the 70s, 80s were the last time we had, when conditions were generally favorable, to implement a whole new shift in how we do fire. Since then, that has not been the case. I'm sorry, I need to keep moving along. The other thing that happens in the mid-'80s is something called the wildland-urban interface, a term coined in Southern California, a really geeky term, but we're stuck with it. And I see it as a kind of recolonizing, an urban recolonizing of what had been rural lands. And that brings different expectations and problems. And it also brings back urban fire. I mean, this is like watching polio come back. We fixed this problem. Why are cities burning again? Well, because we decided they weren't really cities. And we didn't really need to do that. We don't have these fires anymore, so you're spending money and irritating people with codes and so forth when it's not really a problem. Turns out it was. So that era ends with 2 big blowouts. Yellowstone, 1988. Here was, in a sense, the purely wild environment. About 40% of Yellowstone burned under what was nominally a prescribed natural fire program. We can talk about, if you wish, later about whether that was really the case, but it was certainly presented in that terms, that part of the American landscape. And then urban fire returns big time to Oakland in '91. New metric for fire behavior, number of houses burned per hour, 795 in the first hour. So these 2 extremes are going to be defining the discussion for the next period of time. Extreme landscapes, extreme fires. It starts over again really in '94. The revolution rekindles. The South Canyon fire in Colorado that burned over a mixed crew of firefighters as part of the catalyst. The next year, a common federal wildland fire policy is promulgated. Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, takes a personal interest in fire, announces that we're facing a national fire crisis. And then in 2000, we have two big breakdowns. Fires returned to the Northern Rockies, 90 years after the big blow-up. All that science, all that equipment, all those communications, all those crews, and we can't stop the fires. At the same time, the National Park Service ignites a prescribed fire in Bandelier National Monument in northern New Mexico, which blows up and then burns into Los Alamos National Laboratory. Well, it's bad enough that you're going to burn a town, but if you're going to pick one where you've got a lot of plutonium buried in the soil and you've got where you deal with atomic weapons, that's really not good optics. And the politics made prescribed burning all the more difficult. So it seemed like we couldn't fight fires and we couldn't light them. However, that led in the waning hours of the Clinton administration to a national fire plan, a lot of money, an effort to sort of reboot the program again. But the next decade or so just brings more of the same, more big fires. We now call them mega fires. More towns threatened and burned, and more firefighters killed. So we spent 50 years trying to take fire out, all fire. We spent 50 years trying to put good fire back in, and now I think maybe we're inflecting into another era where revolution may yield to something else. Let's call it resilience. It's a good amorphic term. It can mean whatever you want. 2009, new policy guidelines allowed for more flexibility in dealing with fires, trying to get more good fire, less bad fire, and a national cohesive strategy was demanded by Congress. It's taken a long time. It's still, and will ever be, a work in progress. But I find that interesting, not just because it's about policy, but because it's about politics. We now have a fire community that is not dominated by the Forest Service or the federal agencies. The states are huge players. We have volunteer fire departments are now a part of it, counties. Civil society. The Nature Conservancy burns as much land each year as the National Park Service. And we even have a lobby now for fire suppression, a national association. So how are you going to deal with all these things? You need, in a sense, a fire constitution. Who's responsible for what? Who pays for what? What policies do we agree on? This is a political problem, not just a policy problem. So I think implementing it, 3 parts, fire adapted communities. We've got to protect these communities, or the rest of it nobody's going to pay any attention to. But these are really, my understanding, urban fires, and they need an urban fire solution. And a forward strategy that pursues fires way in the backcountry is not solving it at all. Hardening the communities, and also there's a strong trend to do sort of the CAL FIRE model, which is to become a kind of urban fire service and extend that out beyond the cities. This is the campfire, but I'm sure you've all seen many examples of this, maybe less so in chaparral, but certainly in forested areas where the built environment is incinerated or melted and the trees are fine, right next to each other. One is adapted to fire, one is not. And then we need to work on our landscapes. We need to be able to prevent or be able to control bad fires, promote good ones. We need to enhance the ecological goods and services we get from that. And we need to do this at the same time we're working on the communities. And I think now we also have to take climate into consideration. And I would argue not just climate, but the kind of fossil fuel society that we've created and the ramifications of that, which have extended and which fire integrates well beyond climate. We've created, in effect, a third nature out of these lithic landscapes. So I'm back to our train, the burned landscape on one side, the unburned on the other. Do we have a narrative? Yeah, we actually do have a great narrative. It's the story of humanity and fire. It's continuous. It's unbroken. And do we have an analog? Yeah, I think we do have an analog. That when you add up all the things we're doing with fire, we're creating the fire equivalent of an ice age. So let me summarize the history and then work on the analogy and wrap this up. We have 420 million years or so of first fire. As long as terrestrial life has been on the continents, we have evidence of fire, but it's very patchy in space and time, ignited overwhelmingly by lightning. Second fire people, we recode all the patches and pulses. We expand the range of fire. We change the timing. We change the fire regimes. And what lightning has available is what we don't treat in advance. And now, oops, we come to third fire, and you can see I'm klutzy with this, but you can also see I'm no graphic artist. So I'm trying to illustrate how do you talk about a fire that's coming out of the geologic past and whose effluent is going into the geologic future and is being burned in the present. And what that happens, I think, is that it's a great era for wildfire in wildlands, and it's a great era for burning fossil fuels. It's not such a great era otherwise. Lots of evening satellite photos. Here, Europe and sub-Saharan Africa, two grand realms of combustion, one burning in living landscapes, one burning lithic. Granted, there's a lot of hydro in Europe. France has a lot of nuclear power, but this is really a fossil-fueled society. And you see two very different expressions of people relating to fire. But what's gone is the second fire. And that's what's been, and that is what, in part, we need to restore. And I'm left with the paradox that megafires are really a pathology of the developed world. Why is that? Don't we have all the machinery? Don't we have all of this assorted power? Why is it that is affecting us and not people who have not converted to this in the same way? So as the U.S. show this, let me suggest this is a NASA map of hotspots. I think it's 2013, showing burned area. The yellow are wildfires, the red are sort of agricultural burning, prescribed fire, and that's a map of what it would look like in that year. And this is a map of CO2 emissions. So, okay, it's a little apples and oranges here, but we don't have good metrics for fire, so give me a little slack here. And it may be hard on the screen, but if you look at that more finely grained, you'll see that you have one or the other. You don't have both. So another map showing some of the little more historical mapping burned area from mid-1920s to 2018 against fossil fuel emissions. And I don't know if you can see it very well, but the burned area is plummeting down, fossil fuel emissions going up, and we have this sweet spot about 40 years after World War II, where burned area is decreasing rapidly, and all the smoke associated with burned areas decreasing rapidly, and we're transferring, in effect, all of our firepower is now coming from fossil fuels, and we're taking some steps to help control those emissions. This is a time in which a large fraction of the American population has grown up, or been born in, or experienced, and take as normative when it isn't. This is this kind of odd sweet spot of history. And if we look at that revolution in fire policy, it comes right in the middle of it. So we're seeing the effects of this even in advance of seeing climate change. So megafires have now joined our forlorn polar bear as an emblem of the Anthropocene and all the changes humanity is creating, and often taken as an emblem of climate change. I would expand that to say that what we're seeing is an expression of this fossil fuel civilization, of which climate change is part, but also how we use land, how we get power, how the pathways for all kinds of invasives, even our plastics and petrochemicals, how we make things up, and fire exclusion. Take away all our air tankers and helicopters, take away our bulldozers and the engines, take away our chainsaws and pumps, and could we even pretend to fight fire? No, we would have to do what humans have always done. We would manipulate the landscape into a favorable form, and we would substitute our fires for wildfires. Fires will come by choice or chance. We relied on that industrial counterforce for a while, and for a while it worked. And now we can't, because the larger consequences of all this, particularly in the atmosphere, are overwhelming our ground forces. And we're seeing collisions of these two combustions. I like the power line fires. I mean, I don't like them, but they're a graphic emblem of where these two realms can collide with catastrophic results, and may even give rise to novel landscapes. So we had a fire crisis before climate change became recognized, and now that's morphing into a fire epoch, or what I call the Pyrocene. I think the Pyrocene has been going on all of the Holocene, but over the last 200 years it's been given afterburners and is now overwhelming systems. So in the Pleistocene, time mostly of ice, 80 to 90% of it being ice informed with small interglacials. Milankovitch cycles sort of were the pacemakers, a lot of ice shrouded landscapes, lots of periglacial landscapes, outwash plains, permafrost, lots of other collateral things associated with the ice, drops in sea levels, mass extinctions. And here we are, the hominins. We are a genus of the Pleistocene. And here we are, this image of erectines bringing fuel to the fire, because that's what you do. And a Pyrocene, it's being driven by anthropogenic fire in various forms. Fire-informed biotas, shifts in biogeography, are driving out the last of the ice and all the associated species with it. All the collateral landscapes, and we might consider these immense smoke palls as a kind of outwash plains for this era. Change in sea levels, mass extinctions. And here we have modern industrial society. This is from the Fort McMurray fire in Alberta. Fort McMurray set up to mine tar sands, a particularly dirty fossil fuel. And now it's having burned its candle in a sense at both ends, it's being hit by large bushfires coming out of the boreal forest. And here we are running from the fires, using our cars to try to escape. So as we go into the future, it has always been the human dilemma to pass between two fires, but now I would argue the challenge is to pass between three. And it is a three-body problem with no exact solution. But I would remind us of the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, who declaimed, "They shall go out from one fire, and another fire shall devour them." There is no escape from fire. There is no way we can't manage fire. And in fact, it's our ecological charge. We are the fire management creature. And we have managed fire successfully for several 100,000 years as a species until the last century or so. So surely we can draw on that history and heritage and manage our way through the coming era of fire. So with that, I will extinguish, and invite the panel to come up. Thank you for your attention.
So now what I'd like to do is invite a panel of experts. So we'll have Nick Elmquist, if you can come up. And we'll also have Leila Carvalho.
Moving live.
And finally, Max Moritz. And they're going to start off asking some questions, and some discussion will occur. And then if you're interested in asking a question, we have some microphones set up here. So as they start their panel activities, feel free to line up, and you'll get a chance to ask a question. Okay?
He said I should stand.
Okay.
I don't know what.
Who's going? He introduced you first.
All right, so I think we're supposed to. It's on? Can you guys hear me? Okay. Introduce ourselves before we ask our questions. So my name's Nick Elmquist. The last time I sat where we were sitting here for this, it was during a commencement ceremony when I graduated from UC Santa Barbara in 2000. About the same time, I started working as a seasonal firefighter for the Sequoia National Forest. And, it was just progressed through the Forest Service agency the last 12 years working for the local Los Padres National Forest. 3 years ago, I got my current position with Montecito Fire Department, working as a wildland fire specialist. And I'm on incident management teams that go out and manage fire and get to work on cool projects, including sitting on this committee, part of the Fire Safe Council, working with Ethan and local, the burn cycle, and just really cool things that happen with our community that's very environmentally conscious and pays attention and appreciates our natural area. So should I ask a question, or do you guys want to introduce yourself first? You guys can introduce yourself.
Yeah, okay. Woo. So, I'm Leila Carvalho. I'm professor in the geography department. I have all my degrees in atmospheric sciences. I'm a climate scientist. And I got all my degree in Brazil. And so in there, I was studying floods and monsoon systems. And I joined UCSB in 2009 when we had the Ressuscita fire, right, that year. And that was when I was introduced to the pyrocene era. And then after that, this was such an intense event, and then I decided I want to do something about it. And I started investigating our major fire weather that we have here, sundown winds. I believe everybody knows what it is. So then my research has been part of my research. I still study extreme events, but part of it is also understanding fire weather and weather and fire regimes in California. Okay, so now, Max.
Hi, I'm Max Moritz. I'm a biogeographer by training from this fine institution. For the last 17 years, I've been a statewide fire specialist within the University of California Cooperative Extension. That's a faculty line within the Agricultural and Natural Resources Division of UC. Most of my work has been in spatial analysis and modeling of fire regimes, what drives them, fuels, issues, extreme weather. My lab's done a lot of fire and climate change projections, and more recently starting to look at home losses and where and how we build and the land use and urban planning parts of that problem. And I want to say from all of us, I think thanks for being here, and thanks for your imprint on how we look at fire. I think it's important, and I certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Start asking questions.
I guess I could go first. So one thing that I was thinking of is, you kind of frame it that we're in the era of fire, but I think we're also in the era of information. And a lot of information that the public receives is very easy to be over dramatized especially as it regards to fire. It's easy to create a website or an organization and highlight all the mismanagement that you articulated very well, and create this mistrust in a lot of the agencies, especially land management agencies. And obviously, a lot of fire scientists, and I believe yourself too, reading your books and your papers, believe there needs to be management and fuels management, whether it's wildfire for fire use and whatnot. So I guess my question is, from your perspective, what's the best way for agencies to gain that trust back from the public?
Wow, great question. Sure you wouldn't like to do that, Max? Two observations. One is that fire is always, not always, but often misused. It is so graphic and so visceral that you want to have fire in the image, in the story, even if it's not about fire necessarily, because fire will get attention. And so we see a lot of effort to animate various agendas by appealing to fire. And the solutions often have very little to do with fire. So that's part of the issue is identifying when are we doing something that actually speaks to fire, addresses fire, and when is it, well, it's really about this other subtext, and we're using this to get attention, and then this is what subliminally we're trying to push in. I don't see how we can manage fire unless we manage the landscape. But that means lots of things. Europe has traditionally, and parts of certainly Mediterranean Europe, has had lots of fire for very long periods of time, and historically they contain it by land management. They cultivate it. They use lots of fire. And you have big breakdowns in European fire when the social order and the agricultural order, the landscape order, breaks down, as in, say, in Portugal and Greece are classic examples of this. In this case, it's for economic reasons. People leave the countryside. So we have a problem with people moving out into the countryside. Mediterranean Europe has a problem with people leaving the countryside, abandoning it so it overgrows and then has problems. So there are lots of ways. Other people may say, well, this is really, what we really need to do is to introduce logging. If we log this off, we wouldn't have these big fires. Well, historically, up until about 50 years ago, so 60 years ago, almost all of the major fires were associated with logging slash of one kind or another. So you've got to clean that up. That causes lots of smoke if you burn. There are all kinds of issues that aren't addressed. So that can be confused with, say, thinning, which is a kind of weedy woody. So what you need is a suite of techniques. You need a cocktail of treatments that are suggested to a particular place and its circumstances. And the north side of a hill will be different than the south side, the bottom from the top. I mean, we need much more nuanced approaches. But we need to be very wary about people with other agendas. I mean, I have this vision, I'm sorry, I'm lecturing again here, but I have this vision of all these people standing around this big fire, and they're all attracted to the fire. You want to be around the fire. But they all have their backs to it, and they're using the fire to speak to some other group here. And see what happens if you don't follow my agenda. And what we need to do is, what we all have in common here are these big fires. Why don't we talk to one another across the fire and see what actually makes sense? And what I find convinces people is to bring them out in the field for demo plots and to show them. And then ask, okay, here we are. You're all yelling at each other on Twitter or whatever. What are you going to do here? This spot. No, let's not talk abstraction. What are you actually going to do here? What choices do you make? And what happens if you don't make a choice? And that seems, in my experience, has a clarifying effect. You're grounded in a literal sense. It doesn't always work. But taking people out for demonstrations, showing stuff, tends to be effective. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Next. Okay. I got your book, The Pyrocene, and I thought this was a fascinating book, and I recommend everybody. But I feel there is one, as a climate scientist, I have my biases, and I feel like this discussion on wildfires has placed a lot of emphasis on land management, fire management, fire suppression, history, and so on. But I'm from Brazil, and Brazil, like the dry season, everybody there are no dry fields. Everybody set fires on dry fields, and this fire season is like the dry season is like this, but with smoke, right? And we know there is a big feedback on climate, right? So you have aerosols being released, and you have this impacts cloud formation, precipitation, and that will impact back fire, right? So the piracy is not a problem only for the United States; it's a global problem. And my question for you is, more precisely, do we really know what would be the impact? Because we need to do so much of this fire management. What would be the impact of of having more the fire of choice, right, as you say, against the fire of chance? And what do we really know? Do we need? What can we expect in your perspective in this regard?
Yeah, another great question. I don't think we do know. And I think we can expect a lot of unintended consequences. People in the past, I mean, in some ways, it's easy to mock some of their decisions now, and some of them deserve it, some don't, but often they used the best information they had, and they were wrong. So we should always be very humble about what we know and don't know. I think we know enough to begin changing the trajectory of what we're doing now, and then learn as we go. And I don't mean to dismiss the climate element of this. Part of my interest in the piracy was to see if I could shift the discussion a little bit, because it seems to me a lot of the debate over climate versus land use, climate this, how much climate change going on, is kind of rutted. People have their positions, and it's hard to change them from that. And one of the things I do, which is probably going to irritate everybody, is to make climate history subordinate to fire history. And that forces you to come at it a little sideways and maybe rethink some of those positions. Whether that's acceptable or not, I'm not a climate scientist, so I can say that. But I think if in fact burning fossil fuels and a lot of our other land use changes, which are generally assisted by fossil fuels in one way or another, if that's really what's changing the climate, then fire history is the core. And I don't want to make it a stupid argument, academic argument, well, who's more important, but it forces us to reevaluate it a little bit differently, a little bit different terms. Maybe that would help. And I don't think that, no. Come back to Brazil another time. I'm sorry.
Okay, so I want to talk about the wildland-urban interface, our geeky term, because I think as we sprinkle more people and communities on fire-prone landscapes, that problem's not going away, and with climate change making the problem worse too. I borrowed this term of coexisting with fire from some Australian colleagues, and to me and to some other people I've talked to, it kind of implies someday down the road being able to sit inside a home and watch the fire go by, right? And that, I guess, I'm wondering how far off is that really? How close could we come to that? Because you're talking about hardening structures, and maybe even using prescribed fire closer to homes. Someday we're probably going to have to become more comfortable with that. But is that really going to do it? Can we really get there? And have you seen in your travels in time and around the world, have you seen a culture that actually maybe has built differently and lives with fire differently in a developed way?
If we think of developed countries as basically those that have converted to fossil fuels as a primary, no. But there are others that rely on resilience, the capacity to rebuild quickly. And people who use fire widely tend not to do a lot of their burning next to their houses. They move around the landscape. They occupy it seasonally. And so they have lots of temporary structures. And so part of the problem is that we have a legal system of land ownership which fixes us in a particular place, and we can't move as well. So that's it. I'm a great fan of the home ignition zone concept, but I don't think it's complete by itself. His home ignition zone, I would add a hers, home environment protection zone, because I think we need larger areas. And I don't think fuel breaks are the way to do it, because fuel breaks tend to be too narrow and can be breached, and fuel breaks require maintenance. And unless you keep being pounded by fires, the maintenance doesn't continue. What you need, I think, are large green belts. And then they're multiple use, so that they can be maintained with or without fire, and that can provide a zone. So not just the individual houses, but the larger zone. And since we're sitting here in mass and distributed the rest, I mean, protecting the WUI problem is not unlike COVID. I mean, hardening houses against embers looks a lot like wearing masks to prevent aerosols spread. And defensible space looks a lot like social distancing. And then getting enough of the community to do that looks a lot like herd immunity. And fire, in a sense, is a contagion phenomenon. You can model it essentially the same way.
Yeah.
So, but I also, part of that, in my experience too, is that voluntarism isn't enough to do that. And it was not enough in cities to keep cities from burning.
Yeah.
You had to enact those nasty codes and enforce them. And insurance wasn't enough in urban landscapes to do it. Insurance had to have a political platform, a set of conditions within which they could compete. Otherwise, it didn't work. So I think we can learn from our past. How did we keep cities from burning? What do we need to do in our new ex-urban environments? We have experience of success. But I don't see an alternative at some point to doing what people really don't want to have happen, which is to say that you have to legislate conformity. There are certain social standards that we have to have. Because I can protect my house, but if the person next to me don't, I'm still going to be at risk. I'm not sure we're prepared to do that, but I'm sorry to say it, but that's.
All right, I'm going to.
Hi, sorry. I was wondering what you would suggest to students and young people who are interested in getting involved and possibly having, I guess, a career in land management and wildlands fires.
All right, going live. Do you want me to stay on there?
Well, it would be nice if you had some experience with fire, real fire, not just virtual fire and simulated fire. That can take a lot of forms. There may be lots of opportunities, even field research. I would also say that while the technical skills are important, we're dealing with people. We're not just in a natural environment, we're in a moral landscape. And understanding something about the history, understanding cultural and the cultural conditions that influence fire would serve you well. And I would say learn to read and write well, even if you're doing PowerPoint, because that will help you structure your presentations better, being able to communicate with people. So yeah, there are a lot of technical things you need to learn, a lot of skills, but I think particularly if you're in at the college level or beyond, expanding your notions. Why do these people seem to be doing okay and we aren't? Or why is this group doing well? How do they think about it? Why is it that that Australia has a continuous heritage of painting, fire paintings going back to Aboriginal bark paintings. Unbroken, continuous. And Canada has none. I don't think there's a Canadian painting until about 10 years ago, except for Paul Kane, 1840s, painted a forest fire outside what is now Edmonton. No, why wouldn't Canada have that? Why does the United States have a prairie fire art? So, some societies have it, some don't. Sweden has nothing on fire. Russia has a lot. Had a whole school of fire paintings up to the revolution. So we're thinking about how do people relate to fire? You know, and fire isn't just an ecological process, and it isn't just a tool. It's also a relationship. And I think a case could be made it's our first domestication, because it requires something from us. We have to tend it. It doesn't just sit there by itself. So my recommendation, think about some of the other things that impinge on fire.
Okay, good.
I realize most natural scientists hate to deal with people on this for lots of reasons. Can sympathize with, not the least that it really mucks up your modeling because you're dealing with all this soft stuff that can't be quantified and understood. But isn't that what's driving all this stuff? And to have some appreciation for that, I think would be in your interest.
Mr. Pyne, if you don't mind if I just add,
Sure.
I think also, just to plug the geography department, GIS is really the language of land management, and you'd be served well with, taking advantage of the department, which is really highly qualified here, and learning at least the basics, because even fuels planning to hydrology to, whatever, land management, geology, all with the Forest Service, the local Forest Service, Los Padres have a lot of positions. Some of them are here and they could introduce themselves afterwards, but they all utilize GIS.
Yeah, very much. Yeah. That's probably the critical technical thing. But otherwise, look at other sciences. I mean, learn about winds. I mean, so much of it is weather. Just even a little bit can help you.
Try to
You
be
get
as
ideas.
as possible.
We might need a fire here to stay warm.
I know. It's quite cold. Hey, Nick. Hey, Layla. Hey,
Oh my
Max.
God.
Thanks for the talk, Steve, and thanks for the interesting perspectives. As you were talking about, it involves people a lot. It seems like a lot of the problem deals with like the public perception and fire dramatized in the media and vilified, and it almost creates this perception that the public demands this military fighting response. And so, people are blaming fire agencies and suppression and stuff like that, but to me it's like the source is that public perception. Though, do you have any insight on how to reach more people? Obviously being a good fire author helps, but yeah, it seems like we need more.
Well, I'm not sure how effective my fire authorship is. All of my non-fire books have always done better critically and commercially than my fire books. I'm not sure there's a large audience out there for a lot of this stuff unless it's really human interest. Disaster stories, firefighters battlefield, firefighters as heroes, that kind of trope. Part of the problem is because people don't experience fire in their lives anymore. In the Plumas Boundary Survey, 1904, everybody who's reading this is going to have fire in their homes. They're going to be burning trash. They're going to be burning, windfall and leaves. They're going to be people where I grew up in Phoenix were burning their lawns when I was a kid. Fire is now gone out of urban life and suburban life. How many people now live in a sufficiently rural or wild setting that they see fire in their daily life and can relate to it? Almost nobody. Whereas 100 years ago they could. They would have had it. I remember visiting my grandmother in San Francisco on Crescent Avenue in this wooden row house. She has a wood-burning stove. That's how she cooked. We were out in the back breaking up wood boxes to cook the meals. So there was a connection to fire that now is gone. and is only channeled in certain ways. So part of that, I think, is, again, getting people out to see it and see what it really means. And I think my experience is that most people are happy with wildfire in wild lands. They just don't want it in their backyard. And I understand that. So I think whatever suite of reforms we propose, it's got to be found, it's got to be anchored in the fact that we are doing the best we can to protect these communities. We are not putting people's lives in danger. And everything else we're doing is a part of that, but we are very visibly doing that. And then inviting people to participate. I mean, people actually pay money. There's actually a fire tourism now in the Flint Hills in Kansas where people will pay money to be able to go out and help burn every year. And I think people are not intrinsically afraid of fire. I mean, in some ways, it is in our genome. If we were afraid of fire, you would have been out of the gene pool a long, long time ago. So I think it's possible. It's just a way of parsing it so that you know how to do it.
Hello. I had a question. We're about 20 years from Healthy Forests and the CWPP, and I'm wondering if you have a sense of what the next policy shift at the federal level is going to look like. If you think we need some sort of extreme catalyst, I would think the mega fires that we've had might have already done that, but they haven't. So, just your sense of what the future of that looks like.
That's a good question. You know, I thought after Santa Rosa burned, this has got to be the tripwire. I mean, if this doesn't do it, nothing is. And then Paradise burns. Well, if that didn't do it, nothing. I don't see that it changed nationally. Part of it is that it's not seen as a national problem.
Yeah.
It's seen as a story of Californians or Westerners generally doing dumb things like building houses where there are fires. But I think as a result of climate change and land use, we're starting to see the fires go to where the houses are. When Gatlinburg, Tennessee burns, that changes the narrative. When Bastrop County, Texas, which is east of the 100th meridian, burns, that changes the narrative. When you have wildfires in the coastal plain between Georgia and Florida that threaten communities, that's changing it. Now it's nationalizing it. The problem is that so much of the influential media and tastemakers and political interests is in the Northeast, which is an anomalous part of the country because it's a temperate landscape, temperate climate, where you don't have regular wet dry cycles, which is what you need for fire, and which California has in extreme expression. It's going to be slower for them to get it, but they've had it in the past. I mean, coming here, we were telling, you know, the Adirondacks, 600,000 acres burned in 1903, and another 400,000 in 1908 before they finally got a handle on it. Southern New Jersey, the Pinelands, has one of the most volatile fire environments in the world, in the country, and they've just been given special legislation to enhance the prescribed burning they do. So I think it's partly a question of nationalizing the issue and changing some of the narrative. Right now it's easy to dismiss. And part of that, I think, is smoke. Smoke has a great influence here because now it's not just a fire that happens in some obscure California town. Smoke is immersing large urban areas in dangerous air quality. And I can see some of these smoke piles may function like the great dust storms of the Dust Bowl, and are carrying the message and the sense of alarm well beyond where the fires themselves are. And part of my interest in a universal fire narrative is to put sort of the fossil fuel, other stuff, it's all part of a fire story that comes in this, so it makes it harder to disentangle. So I'm telling most of you, well, unbundle this so you can be specific, and here I am, I'm doing the opposite. I'm bundling it to try to get a different effect. So.
Do you have one more question? Do we have time for more questions?
Thank you. Whoa. I'm Gordon Siki. I'm the San Marcos Trout Club. And Max, I wanted to follow up on your, will there be a time when you can be in your home and watch the fire go by? That really intrigues me, and I think there's a lot to be said about that. And your comment that the fire community now goes beyond the federal structures into all kinds of community structures. And Max, I know that your regional wildlife mitigation plan is kind of just coming really apparent in our community. And it's really exciting to me to hear about all the things that you're doing that I think maybe if people work together, they could actually maybe stay in their house and watch the fire go by because their house is hardened and they can survive. I was wondering if you could share some of your enthusiasm for your program, because I think that's big news as far as I'm concerned.
Going back.
Please.
Well, thanks. I'll just say this is more about our guest, but I'll say a few words. It actually resonates a bit with Steve's comment about buffers. One of the things that we've noticed about the Santa Barbara Front Country is that the ag buffer behind Goleta and behind Carp Summerlin is still there, and it still actually protects those communities to a certain degree. And it's gone, above Santa Barbara, and if it ever existed, above Montecito. So we have a program locally to look at how to reinstitute something like a buffer across the wildland-urban interface to provide some of that protection. And then to also educate the people, get as many communities as we can plugged into Firewise USA. And I'd actually kind of be curious to hear your unvarnished opinion of some of that training. And then to map all the built environment that needs to be retrofitted and prioritize that. And it turns out we have a program getting off the ground, a regional wildfire. It's actually a regional wildfire mitigation program. That'll take a few years, but at the end of this, we'll have pretty much the whole region mapped and prioritized, and have an implementation plan for how to move forward. But I'd love to hear your impression of CWPPs and Firewise, and how effective some of that actually ends up being.
I'm all in favor of it, but I think again, the scale's too small. And the pace is too slow, and I wish that weren't the case, but it seems to me it is. And I can't find historical examples where that kind of thing could move at the rate we need without being compelled in some way. That this is enough of a community, a social problem, that we have to recognize it and treat it as such.
Going in.
We have time for one more, and then the reception
Got
is
her.
that way. Walk along that way.
Hi, thank you all. I guess my question is about coordination across scales. So you mentioned kind of the importance of very tailored treatment plans kind of on the ground, that you might do something different on the north of a hill in the south. But the decisions about where money is going and how much is going is being made at a much higher level. So I'm curious how important you think it is, and how much of a challenge it is to kind of keep goals and priorities the same across those different scales where decisions are being made.
Well, as with all things, it depends. We want fire adapted communities. Well, that's a pretty good goal. The mission, what that means at different levels, is going to change. And I don't know how much we have to oversee the conformity of that, or define it too narrowly. I think we've got to have lots of room. One thing I didn't talk about that I think is a really interesting development over the last decade is the growth of managed wildfires.
Okay.
And that, for me, is what prescribed burning in the West at scale means. And agencies have not done well presenting their case for it. Partly, I think they're afraid to say, because it will be misrepresented. But it's been very successful. I've watched 3 mega fires out of my study window. in the Phoenix metropolitan area in the last 3 years, each of which were managed that way. Had an advantage. The prevailing winds were blowing the smoke away from Phoenix, so that helped. But there are lots and lots of other places where this is the only way we're going to get enough fire at scale. And I think we might be able to do it more shrewdly and think about our burnouts as prescribed fires done under urgent conditions rather than emergency backfires. Do it with a little more finesse. But otherwise, we're simply turning the project over to feral flame. I mean, it's deciding, okay, we're not going to do anything more on COVID. COVID will do the job for us eventually. So I think this is our best alternative. Not everywhere, but in lots of places. It seems to be working in the Northern Rockies. It seems to be working in the Southwest. Some of the backcountry in Colorado is doing it. A lot of beetle-killed areas. They don't want to put people in, understandably. So they're relying on that. We're good.
Yeah, so now we'll be having our reception, and I have been sort of waving over there, but I think if we walk along this sidewalk here, go up those steps, and then start walking north, that will get us to the SRB terrace. And so there should be signage. There was supposed to be. So with that, I'll be taking the speaker over to the reception. We'll be there from 5 o'clock till about 6:30, 6:45. So I hope you can make it. And there is food there, and water and other drinks. Thank you.
Should probably check. It's cold. Blue pen. I hate the blue pen. Just size the blue pen out of my pocket. Run this over to the. No, very nice. I'll be back.
Yeah, that's a great job.
What's going on too?
Oh, with those for students?
Those are from Geography 4. They get 1% extra credit for.
A lot of kids in geography in the audience today. A lot of your questions were from our grad students. I mean, even the guy that asked you was also